there are over 30 characters who can join you in Octopath Traveler 0, each of which have different skill sets based on their job, some of which include unique passives and unique skills, and they have a unique ultimate. So of course, some of them are better than others. But since the game's so long, and since many of the game's strongest characters are in the latter half, where you've probably played for like 70 plus hours, I wanted to focus on the game's first two major story arcs. I'm not going to go into too many details. I'd like to keep this as spoiler-free as possible. In other words, I'm not going to talk about major story events. What I will say is, in terms of determining what is early game versus what is mid-game, early game are the first 3 story arcs you get after completing the prologue. Mid-game is after that. And of course, something else to keep in mind is that this list is just my own personal opinion based on my gameplay experience. But I wanted to talk about some of the strongest characters because this was a question that I had, especially in the early game. The game threw so many characters at me, but I was like, wait, who's actually good? Now, for a few more quick caveats. 1, I'm excluding a couple of characters because they join as part of very specific storylines. 2, I'm trying to follow things that people will naturally encounter playing through the game. I think there are some characters that you can actually go out of your way to get early. I'm not really counting that stuff. I'm just doing it based on when I did it. Maybe I did that by accident, but I didn't go out of my way to do so. Third of all, a lot of the gameplay that I'm going to be showing is from a save file that's much later on. That's just what I had as a save file where I had progressed the characters and unlocked all of their skills. And last but not least, if you want to see late game characters, please do let me know down in the comments below and also get subscribed. But with that out of the way, let's get into things, starting with the early game. Okay, so first up, Stia. She's a bit of a DPS support with her custom architect class, but you can kind of think of her as just an apothecary. So she can heal allies, use some pretty good axe attacks, and then she can give herself random attribute buffs and share them to other allies, which isn't a particularly useful thing because you never know if you're going to get a useful buff or a useless buff like Phys attack on a caster or elemental attack on a physical attacker. Now, her passive Unsung Hero is quite good. It means that you stick Stia in the back row when she doesn't need to heal, and congratulations, the paired ally is completely immune to status ailments, which is really strong, especially against some of the more annoying bosses. And then you have Full Cheer, which raises BP recovery for part of your allies. So ultimately, I would say that Stia is decent. I didn't end up using her that much early on, as I went for a different character instead, but I probably should have used her for reasons that I'm going to get into shortly. Also, because she's one of the first characters you get, you're going to be using her for a while regardless. Next up we have the Hunter Fen, who is kind of a tank archer, which is a very interesting and, in some cases, impractical combination. His signature skill, Avenging Triple Shot, deals significantly more damage if he takes more hits. Similarly, the Strength to Protect raises his Phys attack every time he takes damage, and his Shield of Hope reduces damage taken by all allies, and yes, that is a small typo in the game. Now again, Fen is one of the earliest characters you're going to get, so you're probably going to be using him for a while. But personally, I found tanks to be very unreliable, where yes, you can taunt enemies, but if the tank moves to the back row, or just if the enemy decides, hey, I'm not going to listen to the taunt, it doesn't end up doing that much. So while he's decent, I certainly think there are better options, some of whom are available early. Then you have Kelsis, a thief tank. That's right, a thief who cannot steal, and instead taunts enemies and lowers their accuracy. Now in terms of just damage mitigation between things like Sidestep and Detect Danger and Vim and Vigor and his ultimate Master of Evasion, he's kind of a master of not taking damage. Again, enemies will not always attack your tank, and while he doesn't take very much damage, he also doesn't do very much damage if all you're doing is using damage mitigation skills. Plus, most of his things are physical related, so if an enemy goes full caster on you, there's nothing you can really do. In short, while Kelsis is an early recruit who you'll probably be using for a bit simply because of that, I think he's one of the weakest characters in the game. Then there's Macy, your first proper apothecary who you meet in Emberglow. She can heal allies, poison enemies. Fun fact, her Poisonous Touch is actually a pretty darn solid attack, especially early on, and she even has Rest to clear status ailments. Now her Prism Mist grants a random positive effect to all allies, which is bad. I'm just going to say it's really bad because it's random. It might give you health regen, which would be good, except for the fact that you might not need it because you might have already put health regen on the character from someone else. It might give you BP, which, okay, BP is probably always good. But because it's random and you don't know what it is, I consider Macy to be very weak. I used her early on. I really wanted to like her because I like the paralysis formula and poison touch combo. Don't. Next up, there's Alexia, who, if you head to Theatropolis, you'll be recruiting very early. She's a scholar, and she's no Cyrus from the original Octopath, but she is still very strong. Her spells are specialized for lightning and darkness, two elements that are a little bit mixed. Some enemies have a lot of weakness to this, but many other enemies will be weak to things like wind, ice, and fire, so you may want to augment her casting with other elemental skills through masteries. Now, a couple of very interesting notes. First of all, she has an elemental attack buff, which is quite nice if you don't have a dedicated buffer in your party that can raise elemental attack. Second of all, she has incidental analysis, which discovers weak points after she acts. Quite powerful, unless you kill the enemies, in which case you don't discover weak point, but hey, they're dead, so does it really matter? Last up, Ancient Magic is one of the hardest hitting skills in the game, and it hits everything. It is a huge AoE nuke that was the first skill I damage capped with. Because it's AoE, that is particularly impressive. So, in short, I really like Alexia. Going in, I was like, I don't know about a scholar that only has two elements, but between the Ancient Magic and the Incidental Analysis, and the fact that you can teach her many other elemental skills through masteries, I think Alexia is a great character, and I would highly recommend using her for at least the early and the mid-game. Late game, there are a couple more options. Then we have Viator, the warrior, who is also a tank, sort of. Between things like Vanguard Spear and Charging Strike, and also Talon Strike, he does have more offensive options. And what's particularly interesting about Viator is his Fluid Stance ultimate, where, when the taunt does work, regardless of whether he evades it or parries it, he will retaliate, dealing significant damage. Fluid Stance actually hits quite hard, and for me personally, Viator felt like the only tank character who was actually rewarded for taunting enemies and getting them to attack him. Next up we have Pius, a cleric with an AoE heal, some fire magic, and some pretty darn good back row support from, well, the back row support skill, where the HP regeneration given to a paired ally is really good for your sustain, especially early on. In addition, the ultimate technique, Scales of Justice, lowers defenses on enemies and raises attack on allies, which is very good for nuking bosses in the early game. Since this affects your entire party, you don't have to worry about, oh, but I'm going to swap this character out. It doesn't matter. So personally, I would say that Pius is a strong early game. I do think his offensive options are a little bit limited, as some of his weapon attacks aren't great, but you don't necessarily need every character to have great weapon attacks. Then there is Saurus, the dancer support, who has an absolutely disgusting ultimate, Ruinous Aria, granting an ally the ability to exploit weakness for 2, 3, 4, or 5 turns depending on how much you extend it. Combine this with someone who has innate multi-hit and you will be melting enemy shields. This alone makes her incredibly powerful. In addition, she's got back row support from Back Row Dancer, filling ultimate gauges, and since it's the entire front row, this is very strong. Dancer Respite's pretty good. Her buffs are okay, but realistically what you want to do is stick her in the back row, dump her BP, use Ruinous Aria, and then keep her in the back row for the rest of the time so that you can maximize a back row dancer. Now, Delisha is a character that I wasn't quite sure how to feel about at first. She's a hunter, but she has some elemental abilities and sort of specializes in debuffing rather than the multi-hit attacks that I would expect after playing the original Octopath. With that said, it turns out she's quite good at multi-hit attacks. You just have to teach them to her via other skill masteries. And her ultimate, Gift of Yakik, lowers enemy phys stats and raises ally phys stats. So, as a boss debuffer that also buffs all allies before a break, she's quite strong. In addition, between Extended Enfeeblement and Exacerbate, she is a master debuffer. Not only does she end up debuffing enemies, but you can rotate her with another partner to keep them debuffed for several turns longer than they normally would be. This is an incredibly powerful effect, which resulted in me using Delisha for quite a long time. If you do not use Protagonist Merchant, first of all, I would really recommend using Protagonist Merchant, but second of all, you want Tressa in your party, because you want a merchant to collect leaves to get more money and use that money to purchase resources. In addition, she has several other support skills and even a decent offensive nuke in Peerless Strike. Now, one of my favorite things about Tressa is her SP saver that halves the required SP for the equipped character's skills. This means you can spam skills on her, but more accurately, this means you can master SP saver and give it to other characters. Her call for help is just a whole spam of a bunch of different weapons. This is okay for breaking shields, but honestly I didn't find it to be super effective or anything like that. Personally, I didn't end up using Tressa that much. That is because I used a protagonist merchant, which I would also highly recommend you do. Check out my video on the best protagonist job to learn more about that. And as a result, I don't have too many more thoughts on her skills. Realistically, the problem is I played the original Octopath. I didn't like her story there. Yeah, she was kind of OP there, but here are his other merchant options, which I'll talk about very soon. Now, last but not least, the other merchant you get is Ludo. You obtain him by progressing the Wishvale storyline. This is about the same time that you unlock the training grounds and character ultimates. Now, personally, I think he has a really good offensive kit. He's got a lot of polearm skills, and he can use quite a few of those polearm skills to passively debuff enemies. Things like Arm Crippling Thrust, which deals damage and lowers enemy attack, or Leg Crippling Thrust, which deals damage and lowers enemy speed. In addition, he has Negotiation. With a foe, provides additional EXP and leaves at the end of a battle, which is a very nice unique skill that cannot be trained, so it's a good reason to use Ludo. Also, his ultimate, Enervating Thrust, does solid polearm damage, and, if it breaks something, permanently lowers their shield points, which is really nice for bosses that tend to be annoying and stack up the shield points. If you can't kill a boss in one break, well, hey, you might as well make it easier to break them again. And so this is why I don't particularly recommend Tressa, because Ludo simply does the job better. And if this leads you to say, hey, wait a minute, you're using 2 merchants and 3 bow users, isn't that a little bit too stacked? No, shut up, they're all OP. But again, this list is just my opinion. This is what I'm recommending because these are the characters that I've enjoyed and I've found success with. And so now that I've gone over the characters individually, let's bring everything together with a recommendation for characters and a little bit on their roles. First up, Protagonist Merchant. Why? Arrow of Fortune is super OP, Collect is OP. Use Protagonist Merchant. Number 2, Stia, specifically in the support role. In other words, stick her in the back, dump her BP, and use her ultimate. Then Delicia, who's a damage dealer / debuffer, make sure to pair her with someone who she can swap off with. Say, Ludo. Both of them are bow users, both of them can swap off pretty decently as they don't always need to be in the front row, and there's certainly benefits to Delicia doing things from the back row. Then Cyrus, she is also a support, stick her in the back row whenever possible. Viator, as a tank, I suggest putting him in the front line. You can just use him as a general damage dealer, and you could also pair him off with Delicia, because he's able to charge from the back row for additional damage. Alexia, again, as a damage dealer front and center, you're going to want to charge up her ultimate as much as possible, and in general, the more turns she takes, the more she passively discovers enemy weak points. And then Pius as a support. He does have some damage utility, but in general, you want to stick him in the back row and use him for support effects. Plus, you'll want to bring him forwards whenever you need an AoE heal. So that's a party that I'd recommend for the early game. I did not actually end up using this party that much, because, again, I underestimated Stia, I used Macy instead, and then I realized that Macy's ultimate kind of sucks. I also used Kelsis for a bit, because I was like, I really want to make the rogue tank work, and I ended up being really disappointed in the rogue tank, so basically, learn from my mistakes, don't do what I did, use a stronger party comp instead. Next up, the mid-game, which adds 7 new characters to your roster. Or at the very least, when I was playing through the mid-game, I found 7 new characters during the game's next major story arc. Now, another big change here, you're probably going to have the training grounds unlocked, and you're probably going to have way more JP, meaning you can grab skills from one character and put them on the other character to significantly expand movesets. This means there's even more of an emphasis on things like character ultimates and skills that can't be trained as opposed to the ones that can just be cross-classed. So first up, Primrose, a dancer that specializes in buffing ally attack. And she's very similar to her toolkit from the original Octopath Traveler. Unfortunately, her unique skill, Song of Lunar Shadow, is, I guess, fine, but it's an offensive dark skill on a character who is support who you're probably going to be putting in the back row a lot of the time. In addition, her passive, The Show Goes On, further specializes her for attribute raising effects on allies, which again means you're going to be spending less turns just unloading damage on the enemy. But her Twilight Waltz deals dark damage to all foes, and yes, it does grant SP regeneration, but there are other ways to get SP, such as the Mystic Shot from the Protagonist Merchant, and so I came away feeling a bit mixed about Primrose. On the one hand, I do think she is a strong character, and I think she is well worth using. On the other hand, I don't think she's a must-include the way I would have said for the original Octopath, but let's be honest, most of that is because I really loved her story in the original Octopath. Next up we have the fighter Ulbrich, who has some very powerful attack skills. Most importantly, Wild Thrust, which deals damage 3 to 5 times. This is a good way to break enemy shields if they have a polearm weakness without needing to expend BP. It hits 3 to 5 times regardless of if you boost it or not. In addition, he has a very important passive, Surpassing Power. You're going to need to give him a lot of JP to train this on all of your characters, because this is how you deal over 10,000 damage. So, that is super OP, and you should invest a lot of time in Ulbrich, basically meaning he is a mandatory inclusion in the mid-game. Also, his Unbending Blade deals significant damage, and it's one of the skills that consistently hits over 10,000 for me. Now, in addition, Ulbrich does have some tank stuff. He can taunt enemies, he can raise his own attack, all that, but those aren't really the reasons to use him. I think the reasons to use him are he's an excellent shield breaker, he has very solid damage, he can passively take hits for allies, which is quite nice, and unleashing the Unbending Blade to nuke enemies is fun. Now, going 3 for 3 in characters returning from the original Octopath, we have Alfin, who's an apothecary, and in a lot of ways is a better Stia in my opinion. First of all, he gets Vivify, which revives allies and saves you on olives. Second of all, he gets Vigorous Strike, which deals significant damage the more health you have left. Fun fact though, you can actually give this to other characters. One thing you can't give to other characters though is Pomegranate Panacea, a really strong BP restoration skill that restores BP for all allies. So, you could be fighting a boss, you need to break, don't worry, just give everyone 2 BP. Use all of a BP on your front row to break the enemy, then use all of a BP on your back row to nuke the enemy. This makes Alfin a strong support who is also capable of doing quite a bit of damage. Also, Alfin is another character that I didn't use nearly as much as I should have because I didn't find him until much later. So that's kind of my bad, but also he's very good. I highly recommend him. Next up, Therion, who, depending on the order in which you're progressing, might be the first thief you encounter who can actually steal items. As such, I would consider him to be an auto-include because stealing items is really good. In addition, he's got some fire magic, that's kind of weird, not super effective. He's got HP and SP recovery, and some pretty good debuffs. Now, there's a couple things that make Therion stand out. First is Extended Enfeeblement, making him very good at debuffing. Second of all, BP Thief. Not only does this hit twice, it does solid damage, and it restores BP. So, Therion is all-round a great character to include in your party, especially for when you get him when he can steal stuff from enemies, which is really important and something that Kelsis probably should have learned at Thief School. I kind of get the feeling that while Kelsis' job is thief, he's really more of an exorcist, so that might explain why he doesn't steal. Either way, Therion's great, and in fact, I like Therion more than I did in the original Octopath, at least in terms of the role that he brings to a party. Next up, the cleric Laurana, who is very heavily focused into support. Now, she first joins your party at the very start of the game for a short amount of time, but quite quickly, she disappears for story reasons and comes back later for story reasons. Now, as a support, her most notable feature is Cheat Death. She has Wondrous Veil, which can revive an ally upon them being incapacitated, Encore, which does the same for her, and Maiden's Miracle, which does the same thing for everyone in a row. Now, this is all really strong, especially if the boss uses a party wipe move. The thing is, I found that by specializing into buffers and debuffers, i.e. raising allied defenses, lowering enemy attack, I was more effectively able to prevent death than relying on the cheat death if I actually failed to buff or debuff the boss. So, Laurana is okay, but not exactly my cup of tea. I used her for a bit, and I sort of regret it. Next up we have Heidne, another thief. In terms of buffs and debuffs, I think she is even stronger than Therion. She doesn't get the additional turn, which is unfortunate, but she does lower enemy elemental and fizz attack at once, or enemy elemental and fizz defense at once, making the debuffs far more effective if you're trying to lower damage or do damage. In addition, she has incidental steal, so she can steal items passively. This is quite nice against bosses. Against regular foes, you'll probably want to steal manually because you might kill them by accident if you're just attacking. Her unique effect, the Ring's Grace, means you really want to pair her with the protagonist. This also means you want to pair her with a protagonist job who excels from the back row, such as the protagonist hunter. This way, the protagonist hunter can do something, retreat to the back, Heidne takes over, steals some stuff, and then you rotate back and forth. Her ultimate, Pilfer, not only does pretty good damage, but it means she can steal an item from a foe when the attack is successful. The only downside here is it hits once, though unless you're running up against the damage cap, that's not too big of a downside. So overall, I'd say Heidne is a strong character who's worth using, but a little bit more niche than Therion because you need to make some, well, sacrifices when it comes to your protagonist. And then we have Goodwin, who is an offensive caster slash debuffer dancer. That's right, he doesn't really buff allies, he debuffs enemies. So you have Dance of Mist and Dance of Sloughs. This greatly lowers enemy speed and evasion, making them easier to hit. Very useful against Kates. Levin and Thunder Refrain, solid damage skills. And the Song of Battle, which is a weird skill because it transforms another ally into a tank. This could be good when paired with a tank ally, such as Viator, allowing them to focus on their tank skills while also passively buffing their phys defense. But again, tanking is kind of weird in this game, so I'm going to say it's a kind of weird skill. That said, he also excels from the back row thanks to Vast Energy, where if the equipped character, him, is in the back row, they have a chance to reduce the front row character's BP consumption to 0. Pair this with someone who scales extremely well with extra BP, and you'll be in a good position. Then his ultimate, Song of Levin, deals a lightning damage to all foes and deals additional damage for a certain number of turns. This can be extended, which is very, very fun, and I think it is one of the better offensive ults in the game. So if you're looking for a traditional dancer whose job is to directly support allies by buffing them, that isn't quite Goodwin. But if you're wanting to turn the table on enemies, Goodwin does have some very strong skills. And so putting this all together, what is my recommendation of the best mid-game party? First up, you want a dancer. I used Cyrus, but I do think Primrose is a viable option if you prefer. The reason I prefer Cyrus is because she can use her ultimate to bypass enemy weaknesses. Breaking shields is great, and breaking shields on multi-hit attacks is especially good, so she has a strong synergy with several of the other characters on this list. Next up, Alexia. Why? Because her ultimate is a nuke, and also for all the reasons that I talked about before. Third up, Therian or Heidne. For most of my playtime, I did use Therian. I've been trying Heidne a little more recently because I swapped my protagonist from a merchant over to a hunter. Again, Heidne really excels when paired with a protagonist who can sit in the back row and be a little bit more passive. Otherwise, use Therian. He's a good debuffer and he can steal from enemies. Also, his ult's great. Fourth, Ulbrich. Not only is he a solid DPS, he synergizes very well with Cyrus, since you can use his multi-hit attacks to absolutely decimate enemy shields. P.S. Protagonist Hunter has multi-hit attacks like Rain of Arrows, which also decimate enemy shields. And you need to spend a lot of time using Ulbrich to unlock all the copies of the skill that lets you surpass 10,000 damage. Next up, Alphen. Why? He's a solid apothecary support, and I prefer getting BP on my party better than getting BP gen over time. So, you kind of just swap Stia out and Alphen in. In my opinion, your last two slots vary a little bit more. It's hard at this point in the game with so many options to just say, use this. For example, if you are using Delicia as a debuffer, that's a strong option, especially if your protagonist is no longer using a bow, because you just put Arrow of Fortune on other characters. But if you're not using a bow user, go with Ludo. Ludo is very, very strong. It's just, I can't continually recommend only bow users as much as I would like to. Then, if you want another offensive caster, Goodwin is a very solid option. I found his debuffing, especially lowering enemy speed, to be very helpful on bosses, plus his ultimate just rocks. With that said, while I do think Goodwin is very good, maybe there's some pun in there, I also think Pius is worth considering because he provides solid support and he provides a little bit more healing. Yes, you can just teach healing to Goodwin, but you won't necessarily have the ease of use as it being baked into the character's skills. Plus, Pius has an ult that buffs allies and debuffs enemies, which is very nice if you're lacking buffers slash debuffers, because buffing and debuffing is a very important part of the game. So, those are my recommendations with 6 solid must-includes. Yes, I know, the protagonist is in there, has to be included anyway, plus a couple of slots that are a little bit more flexible. Before wrapping things up, I wanted to take a little bit of time to explore Heidne and Goodwin just a little bit more, because while these are powerful characters, they're not the most straightforward to get. So, first up, how do you get Heidne? You need to encounter her twice. First, outside of Sunshade, where she will challenge you to a battle. Defeat her, and she'll move to a new location. Specifically, in the Flames Grace Wilds, a little bit before you enter the city. Again, talk to her, challenge her for a battle, defeat her, and she moves to a new location. Where is that? Wishvale. At this point, you will properly start her quest and everything's pretty straightforward from here, where you continue through the quest and ultimately, at the end, you recruit Heidne. Goodwin, on the other hand, requires you to be a little bit more adventurous. You need to sail the high seas until you find him collapsed on an island, with very few instructions. Good news is you can inquire further to find out that the food he's looking for that begins with an R and ends with an E is ratatouille. Something that, especially if you encounter him early, you're probably not going to have. There's a couple ways to get ratatouille, the first of which does work early, picking it as one of your initial belongings. But if you're watching this video and you either didn't do that or you ate the ratatouille, don't blame you either way, that one's not going to help. So your other option is to head west from Theatropolis all the way over to Atlasdam, where you will find an NPC by the inn who you can interact with using your path actions. When you do, there's two things you can do. First, inquire. This will get you the cookbook that allows you to make ratatouille. But second of all, you might not have the ingredients, so you can just get some ratatouille from the NPC. This may take a few attempts if you're doing it at a lower level. Also, if you want to see a little bit more about some cool and fun stuff that you can get very early game, check out my video on how to get the Forbidden Greatbow and Forbidden Tome early, because this is the sort of OP stuff that you can do and sort of break the game. But anyway, with Ratatouille in hand, return to Goodwin, watch a quite long cutscene, and congratulations, he's a member of your party. And so, those are my thoughts on the characters available in the early game and the mid-game, some of their strengths and weaknesses, and also how they work together. I tried to approach this from a perspective of what each character brought to the table that was unique, and also not just going with recommending the party comps that I used, because I don't think a lot of the party comps that I used as I was progressing through the game were optimal. They just happened to work for me at the time. A good example of this is I spent way too long using both Macy and Lorana, because I was like, well, they have some interesting stuff, and they do, but ultimately, I think other characters do their job better. Now, with that said, if you're looking for more Octopath Traveler content, I've got two recommendations for you. First is my Best Protagonist Job Guide, where I go over all of a protagonist's job and, well, recommend the one that I think is best. Spoiler alert, it's a merchant, but if you want to find out more about why, check out the video. Second of all, how to get the Forbidden Greatbow and Forbidden Tome early. I just mentioned it, they're OP items, basically think endgame weapons that you can get pretty darn close to the start of the game. Both of those will be up in the card and down below. And again, please do let me know if you want to see late game or super endgame character recommendations, and get subscribed so you don't miss the upload. With all of that said, I'm going to get going for now, so thank you very much for watching to the end. I'm glad you enjoyed, and I'll see you in the next one.